So, welcome back. Sorry, the last video got cut off abruptly there. Sometimes Screencastify does some weird things. So, let me just take a few minutes to wrap up. So, the insular cases, these were cases that the Supreme Court was eventually handed this question of, because these areas are now under the control of the United States, does that mean that the same legal protections, basic legal and political rights, do those extend to the people living in those territories? And ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that it did not. That just because those areas were under United States control, that did not make the people there citizens. It did not mean that they had the same rights as U.S. citizens. And so you can imagine the controversy that that would stir up even now. So that was still a question about how to handle that and whether that was right or wrong and all those kind of things that will persist for quite some time. Now, the last sort of big question, but certainly not literally the last, like there aren't any more, but the last big one that we want to discuss that came from this was the question about Cuba. Recall that the United States had sworn over and over and over again and had promised, because of that Teller Amendment, that this war was not about acquiring Cuba, it wasn't about annexing Cuba, it was about helping Cuba to become independent. But yet a lot of Americans were really, really conflicted about this, including President McKinley, feeling like Cuba was not yet ready for independence and worried about what would happen if Cuba did become independent, because there had been such chaos and there had been massive destruction. There was a lot of rebuilding that needed to be done. Their economy was a mess because of the actions that had been taken. And there was great concern that if you allowed Cuba to become independent, that it would just fall into anarchy and chaos, or that it might be, subject to rule by another power. It's one of those things is, well, we say we're not going to rule over it, but we sure as heck don't want someone else to either. So they're kind of stuck in this, what are we going to do with it? And they're at the moment, it's not quite being ruled over by the United States. It was kind of, the United States has a big hand over it, and there's a provisional government set up by the United States that's pretty much being run by the United States, at least for a while. And that provisional government kind of did secure some assistance in getting Cuba sort of back on their feet, but ultimately they've got to answer this question about Cuba's status, and they've got to decide how they are going to give Cuba its independence as promised, while still maintaining some control over Cuba, which is ultimately what they want to do. And so Cuba officially becomes independent in 1902, I believe. However, the United States finds a way and insists upon keeping themselves closely tied to Cuba, even though they are independent. And they do that by insisting upon some stipulations in the Cuban Constitution, something called the Platt Amendment specifically. The Platt Amendment, this was an amendment not to the United States Constitution, but to the Cuban Constitution, when Cuba officially became an independent nation and officially, took on their own government, getting rid of the, moving on from that provisional government that the United States had set up after the war. This new Constitution was drafted, and this Platt Amendment was inserted in it. And this is the, sort of the leash, that the United States is going to keep Cuba on. So it's you're independent, but, this Platt Amendment. Here's what it says. The Platt Amendment prohibited Cuba, did not allow Cuba, said Cuba could not enter into any agreements or treaties with other countries that might, and here's the phrase they carefully use, that might compromise their independence. In other words, Cuba, you can't get involved in any agreements with anybody or make any treaties with anybody if that might threaten your independence. And the United States can argue there, we're just looking out for you. We want to make sure that everything you do is going to just, make you stronger. We don't want you making an agreement with somebody that's going to cause them to control you. Well, that sounds that way, on one end, but you have to also realize who's going to be the judge of what compromises Cuba's independence? Well, the United States is going to be the judge of that, of course. So it's sort of like, Cuba, you're independent, but we're going to be looking at all this kind of stuff to decide whether or not that's good or whether or not that's bad for you. And ultimately, we will make that decision. In addition to saying they could not enter in any agreements, make any treaties, the Platt Amendment also specifically states that Cuba cannot enter into any financial agreements. They cannot take out any loans or give any loans if that ever became a thing that might, again, compromise their independence. Once again, with the United States being the judge of what exactly compromised their independence and what didn't. So what the Platt Amendment ultimately does is it's saying you're independent, but we still have a hand in it. We still kind of, almost own you in a way. So the United States can take the stance that we're just helping you out and we're making sure that we're still protecting you, enforcing that Monroe Doctrine. But it is also a way, and truly it's a way to make sure that the United States didn't completely give Cuba their independence. It's like independence with a little clause there on the end, don't forget who's really kind of watching your back for good or for bad. Another thing that was agreed to in this Cuba question, the United States or Cuba had to promise to sell some territory, some property to the United States forever and always, and that is Guantanamo Bay. You probably have heard of Guantanamo because that is where there's a military base today. You've heard about particularly military prisons and stuff at Guantanamo Bay, which is still, of course, U.S. territory. So it was in this independence arrangement that Cuba had to promise to sell that to the United States and pretty much, or lease it. I can't remember if it's sell or lease, but anyway, give it to the United States forever. And the only way that agreement can be terminated is if both parties agree to it, which is why, even though the United States does not have a good relationship with Cuba at all, and seeing all this, you kind of understand why. And there's, a total embargo on Cuba and travel restrictions to Cuba and all that kind of stuff's been around for decades, but the United States still possesses the military base at Guantanamo, and that's because of this arrangement that was made in the early 20th century. So, the Spanish-American War, again, that kind of moment where the United States truly takes a place as a true world power that had probably been building for a while. And as well as acquiring overseas territories, this is a moment, whether if you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, a moment where the rest of the world definitely starts to see the United States as a world power, upgrading their diplomatic sort of status of the United States, staffing their embassies with their best people, kind of seeing the United States as a country that, diplomacy was important and, they were a force to be reckoned with, as I said. So what we'll look at next is other ways in which the United States starts to flex that imperialistic muscle more in Latin America than anywhere else. And so we'll continue to look at that next time.